Welcome to Impostor Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self-doubt, featuring imposter characters in their stories, and the occasional imposter who pops up in their day-to-day lives.
And today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Alex Segura. Alex is the best-selling and award-winning author of Secret Identity, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Mystery Thriller, and a New York Times Editor's Choice, and an NPR Best Mystery of the Year. He's also the author of the Pete Fernandez series, as well as the Star Wars novel Poe Dameron Freefall, and a Spider-Verse adventure called Aranya Spider-Man 2099 Dark Tomorrow. In 2024, he published a sci-fi espionage novel, Dark Space, co-written with Rob Hart, the graphic novel, The Legendary Lynx, illustrated by Sandy Jarrell, Encanto, Nightmares and Sueños, and Alter Ego, a follow-up to Secret Identity. In addition to his prose writing, he has written a number of comics for Marvel and DC, including Star Wars, Battle of Jakku, Spider Society, and The Question, all along the Watchtower. With Michael Morisi, he is the writer behind the relaunch of Dick Tracy. He lives in New York City with his family. Alex, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I think I've been excited to be here since we first chatted about this. I think it was at Thriller Fest.
Yeah,
we talked about
that's right. That's right. Yeah, I was enough to share a panel on that one, and that was a great time.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah. I'll say right off the bat, we might, as much as we love talking to you and seeing you, we might have you on the wrong podcast because that bio I just read, and this has happened with a handful of guests already. Like, I don't understand where imposter syndrome comes into someone with that kind of track record and resume. But perhaps
I did. Yeah, I felt really tired as you were reading that in 2024 part, which was newly revised for this podcast. So you first look at my up-to-date bio.
Yeah. Have you been sleeping at all?
No. Yeah. I mean, I can't function if I don't get some sleep, but it has been very busy, and I just had a check-in with my agent today, like kind of like a gut check. Like, he's like, "How are you with all these things that are spinning?" And I think the answer is okay. Like doing the best I can.
Yeah. Well, I would love it if you could because there's like a constellation. There's a lot of kind of meta-ness about the work you have, in your whole body of work, but especially with Alter Ego, with the kind of companion comic book that's just come out. Alter Ego is out on the 3rd.
Yeah.
And then you have kind of would it be a prequel? I don't want to botch it, Alex. So tell us kind of the constellation of this particular world.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So it all started with Secret Identity, which was a murder mystery set in comics in the 70s, and it came out in 2022 from Flatiron. It's the story of Carmen Valdez, who's a queer Cuban-American woman who moves from Miami to New York to pursue her dream to work in comics. She gets a job at this kind of third-rate publisher and is basically told, "We don't want you to pitch any stories." She creates a character, the Legendary Lynx, anonymously with a colleague. Her colleague is murdered, and then she has to investigate the murder to reclaim this character that is literally pulled from her notes and just means the world to her. And in the novel, you have actual pages from the comic interspersed, drawn by Sandy. And what we thought of while we were doing the Secret Identity sequences is this is an actual comic book. Like, wouldn't it be cool if we took these pages, the pages that say, intro pages to Legendary Lynx #1 or final page from Legendary Lynx #3, put them all together, figured out what the gaps were, filled in those gaps with actual comic pages, and collected it as a graphic novel with the very meta tongue-in-cheek, we're finally reprinting this book from the 70s for the first time by Harvey Stern, Doug Detmer, who are the characters in Secret Identity, and apparently Carmen Valdez, like tapping into the drama of Secret Identity and pouring it into this book. We even got J.M. DeMatteis, who has written every notable character from Batman to Captain America to Spider-Man to the Avengers and the Defenders. He wrote a very tongue-in-cheek intro to the graphic novel saying, Lynx was inspirational to me when I was working on these seminal graphic novels like Kraven's Last Hunt or whatever. And it's huge for me because I love his work. So it was kind of a cool fanboy moment. So that graphic novel just came out this week, this Wednesday. And Alter Ego is what Flatiron is calling a quote unquote standalone sequel. And I think that's a really nice way of saying you can read this on your own and it'll be fine. You can
Mhm.
read this with the other two pieces or one of the two pieces and you'll be fine and maybe get a little more out of it. But um, Alter Ego is set in the present day and it picks up immediately at the end of Secret Identity. And without spoiling too much, the end of Secret Identity is a time jump, an epilogue where you jump forward and you kind of see where Carmen is and what happened with the links in terms of ownership and things like that. Um, and so it picks up immediately after that with a reporter who's leaving the interview with Carmen feeling like she has the scoop of the century, like the this great hook to her book, which is a history of female comic book creators and superheroes. And she feels like this is the news peg basically for her book that's going to set it up for
Mhm.
success. And she's murdered. And we don't know what happened. And we jump to a new protagonist, Annie Bustamante, who is a former comic book artist. She had some great success as a comic book artist, but felt really burnt out by comics and moved on to film and was nominated for an Oscar, but now finds herself in this creative lull. Like her last movie was shelved for tax reasons, which if you're a cinema fan, you've noticed that trend. Um, and she's got a young daughter, almost teenage daughter, and she's moved back to New York from LA, and she's kind of wondering what to do with herself and in her spare time, she's been drawing a fan comic of this character that means so much to her that she grew up reading, the legendary Lynx. And she identifies with the Lynx story wise because she loves it, but also because she realized that a Cuban woman like her, Carmen, had written one of the issues. And that's all she really knows, that Carmen wrote one of the issues.
Mhm.
She doesn't know the true story that Carmen created the Lynx, and there's this whole backstory that she needs to kind of unfurl. Um, but as this is happening and she's doing this fan links comic, this company called Triumph Entertainment reaches out to her and says, "Hey, we are the rights holders to the links. We know you're a fan. What can we do to lure you back into comics to reinvent this character? We have this whole multimedia campaign, movies, video games, what have you, and we really want to have a companion comic book, and you're the person to do it." And so it feels really like the perfect moment for her to really write this character that's meant so much to her, and it fills this void in her creatively and professionally. What she doesn't realize is that there's much more to the creation of the character and the people behind
Mhm.
wanting to keep that true origin secret. So she starts getting these strange messages from a character from a I don't mean to ramble on with the plot, but she starts getting these messages from an unknown user named Apparition. And Apparition, she knows, is a character from the Lynx comics. And so if you read the comic, you'll know who Apparition is, but you don't have to know to understand Alter Ego. But um, that basically tees her up to understand that there's more to this than she first thought. And yeah, that's kind of the
Mhm.
springboard. I don't want to spoil the whole book,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you a bit more about that because, in addition to what you just laid out between Secret Identity, Alter Ego, and now the comic book of the links that you're doing as an
mhm.
actual, physical comic book, you also have in Alter Ego, you also have, and there it is. Uh,
Yeah,
you also have a kind of, I guess, what we can call a cameo appearance by Pete Fernandez, who is
yeah,
from another series of yours. And that got me thinking as I was reading with all of these various kind of meta and crossover things going on. When you were kind of embarking on your career as an author, did you have in mind from the jump this idea that like you would have this sort of cross pollinated universe, or is that something that sort of like came along as you got further in?
Oh God, I wish I had that hubris to be like, I'm going to write 10 novels and they're all going to interact with each other. But it did start pretty early, I have to say, when I wrote a novella with Rob Hart called Bad Beat, and it basically was a crossover between our two private eye characters, Pete Fernandez and his character Ash McKenna. I did one with Dave White and Jackson Dunn, who's his PI character. Um, and I was working with Erica Wright on one that we'll hopefully finish at some point when we're not both busy parenting and writing. But and there's also cameos from other PIs in all the Pete books. There's an Elmore Leonard like minor character. Like please don't sue me. Like it's just a name. Like it's not literally the same character. But Kelly Garrett's Private Eye shows up in Miami Midnight.
Mhm.
Steph Chaw's Private Eye shows up in passing, like Pete emails her. Um, So I've always liked that idea of playing in a bigger universe, and I do like to think that my superhero characters all exist in the same universe.
Mhm.
Like they'll reference each other. Like if you don't notice it, it's not going to take you out of the story. But in this instance, I'm glad you noticed it. I'm glad that some people still remember who Pete is.
Sure.
But I had another detective character or like a police officer in the story, and Pete had showed up for like a moment and then went away. And Zach Wagner, my editor, was like, "Well, why not just keep using Pete? Like he's like everyone likes him. Like it makes sense that they know each other. They're both from Miami." And Zach was like, I felt great comfort in seeing him again. And then I felt really great comfort in writing him again, but also writing him in a much better headspace than
Yeah.
in the novels. He's just kind of a miserable, it's his basically his recovery journey. Like there's a lot of
Mhm.
pain and abuse and, just bad stuff happens to him. And by the end of the series, I was like, I'm going to send you off into the sunset and hopefully you'll find some happiness. So it was nice to check in with him
Yeah.
and see that he was pretty happy. So things are going well for him.
Yeah. Love
Mhm.
it.
Well,
Yeah.
Alex, you mentioned that it was, this character's recovery journey, and that reminds me that, one of the elements of your newest book and protagonist Annie's story is
Hmm.
also heavily about her recovery journey, which I really love. And
Oh,
um,
cool.
for a lot of reasons, for as a reader of, mysteries and thrillers and noir, I think often there are characters who are kind of drenched in alcohol. And that's a
Yeah.
big part of, there's a lot of things you can do as a writer with that device. But I think that there's a lot of things that you can do, and you do really well with kind of the journey of sobriety and clarity.
Oh,
And
thanks.
as a sober writer, it's really exciting to read about, kind of the both sides and, even the alter ego ness of having been an active alcoholic or drug addict or
Hmm.
whatever the case may be, and then being someone in recovery and kind of looking back on that period of time. So I'd be curious if you could talk a little bit about what it's like, what that decision was like for you to write that, Annie's story that way, and were there any challenges in kind of toggling back and forth in her life?
Um, Yeah, I wanted to do it, but I also didn't want it to feel like a rehash of the Pete stuff because the Pete
Mhm.
stuff is very dark and he doesn't, sobriety is the kind of thing that doesn't work, it's not a linear thing for a lot of people. It's not just like, I'm free and now from now on everything's fine.
Yeah.
So Pete's story was very kind of stop start. He had relapse in his story, he struggled. Whereas Annie's was dark, but it was much more she got sober and then she stayed sober and that was the blessing of her journey. But um, I always bristle at PI stories that treat alcohol as kind of like this cool like plot twist, like
Mhm.
or that minimize the journey of getting sober because I think it's important to if you're going to include that to do the research and be thoughtful about it and be mindful that it is a journey. It's not like a light switch that you flick off and suddenly you're
Mhm.
fine. You read and this is not a diss on anyone, but sometimes you'll read a story and the character will be like, "Well, I knocked back like three martinis and then got behind the wheel and drove off." I'm like, you should not be driving after one martini, but you probably will not be able to drive. Obviously,
Yeah.
whatever tolerance varies, but I try to just be realistic in the portrayal, and a lot of that makes for interesting narrative. And I wanted to show the duality of Annie. And I'm so glad you mentioned the title because that really is what it hinges on, her like alter
Mhm.
ego. And obviously, it's an alter ego as a superhero trope in the same way Secret Identity is, but
Right.
um, it really is her story of pulling herself out from her lowest bottom and becoming something that she hoped she would be. And I think that's always the goal. I think when you're trying to get things in order. And
Yeah.
so that to me was the most resonant part of her story. And the parenthood stuff I think was really important to me as well
Mhm.
because I think a lot of times protagonists are unencumbered by these things. Like
Mhm.
I was doing an interview earlier this week, and the reporter said, it was interesting you made Annie a parent because usually protagonists aren't parents because then they have to worry about their kids.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really
Mm.
nice to have her worry about her kid because it made
Mhm.
it feel real. Like, who's babysitting this kid while you're off gallivanting, solving the mystery? Like, it
Right.
could very easily fall into the mundane of like scheduling with your babysitter or, picking up at school, but I think it could add texture to the character in the same way the sobriety does, and in the same way the creative kind of art versus commerce stuff does. But I'm glad you noticed that.
Yeah.
Well, there's also a thing that I thought was really sweet about the story. And it also, to me, played a little bit into that kind of not alter ego, but a little of the mirroring of like, Annie's at this point where she's been jaded by the industry. And you do such a great job of
Hmm.
kind of talking about that, the art versus commerce throughout both of those books. But there was something really nice about having her daughter being able to kind of look at the whole thing through the lens of that childhood innocence of like a person who hasn't had to deal with the machinations and the politics and everything of the industry, and just looking
Yeah.
at like that pure joy. And to have her, there are points in the book where she's kind of encouraging Annie just to like do her thing and not worry about
Mhm.
Yeah.
all the kind of surrounding stuff. And that was just a nice, like that was just such a nice use of that parent daughter relationship in the story.
Yeah, I feel like kids can boil things down in a way that we've lost. Like we get so like, the barnacles kind of
Mhm.
cover everything, and it gets harder to see exactly what we want to do. But you almost learn as much from your kids as you are probably teaching them,
Yeah.
because
Mhm.
sometimes my son or my daughter will say something, and you're like, wow, you're just cutting through all the noise, all the smoke, and all the stuff that we like collect over time. And that really was what Margot, her daughter, was main purpose was to really
Yeah.
get in touch with that child in Annie and say, well, just do the fun thing that you like to do, and
Yeah.
everything else is going to just react to that. And it felt nice, and I think it connected nicely. And this is just me as the writer; I'm biased, but it connected nicely with the flashbacks where you did get to see Annie as a child around that age and that wonder. So it was nice to have her tap into it because Margot nudged her along.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I love that. Well, we kind of jumped right into like the plot of this book,
Yeah, we're in
and
the
so
thick of it.
which I love,
Yeah.
but I want to kind of take a couple steps back because I have a lot of specific questions about possible imposter syndrome. But
Yeah.
do you feel it? Do you feel imposter syndrome, whether it be creatively because you've written across numerous medias, or do you feel it in other areas of your life?
I do feel it, no matter how much I do, I do feel it sometimes professionally, just because we're writers, we're like insecure creatures. I think we pour ourselves out there in very intimate ways, and then they get printed in thousands of copies, and people can read your like innermost thoughts. Um, and there's always that disconnect because there's the things I read and I'm like, this is amazing. Like, I love this work, or I love this book, or I love this writer. And then you read your own stuff and you're like, is it ever going to be that good? But you're never going to fairly assess your own stuff. Like, I think for every time I look at something I've written and I'm like, that's pretty great, there's thousands of times where I'm like cringing at yeah, it's why I don't really reread my books.
Mhm.
Like I haven't read the Pete books in a while. I read them recently because I've got the rights again, so I need to find like a new home for them. But it had been a while, and I was actually pleasantly surprised. I was like, "Oh, pretty good." 2016, Alex, like you, not bad. But those moments are fleeting, and I think it's really on us to remind to not be so hard on ourselves. But it's a
Mhm.
challenge not to do that, because I feel like, yeah, I'm my harshest critic, and it happens with comics sometimes too, because I am a prolific novelist and I've done a lot of comics work. But sometimes, like, I was writing the Star Wars thing and I was like, am I really up for this? Like, am I ready for this thing? And then you just have to remind yourself that it wouldn't be happening if you weren't ready. Like, that is a self-fulfilling question. Like, if you're doing the thing, you're supposed to be doing the thing.
Mhm.
If you've gotten the opportunity to do it, that means you're able to do it. And I find that to be soothing.
Right. Well, I was curious about that too, because I mean, you have now at this point, you are in the midst of like you've done Star Wars, Marvel, DC. You relaunched Dick Tracy recently.
Mhm.
You're dealing with these very iconic, like beloved properties, and I wondered, how do you kind of coming into that in the position you are, how do you balance like your reverence for these very beloved properties with also your kind of desire to innovate and take the story forward?
Yeah, it's hard. I think the metaphor of playing with other people's toys is very apt, because you're getting this cool thing that is not yours. Like you get to do something with it, but eventually you're going to have to pass it on to someone else, or it's going to be taken out of your hands and given to someone else. So I usually think about, I always try to boil down the character to what I love about the character and then kind of spring out from there and figure out, well, what can I add to that? And because, these characters are complicated. There's a lot of continuity, there's a lot of backstory, there's a lot of the fan bases are very dedicated. Probably less so with Dick Tracy. Like a lot of people know Dick Tracy, but no one's going to say, well, in the, June 1978 strip on the 13th day, he did this. Like the continuity is different. But with stuff like
Mhm.
Spider-Man, it's this ongoing monthly saga that's been told over multiple titles for years and years and years. So um, I think the challenge is, what do I like about the character? How can I boil it down to what I like so it's something I can obsess over? And then what am I adding to it?
Mhm.
And I think sometimes I've had opportunities where someone's like, "Do you want to do this?" And I don't do it. And this is obviously, it's a blessing to be able to say no to anything, but it's also, if I don't feel like I have anything to add, if I don't have anything to really, make it better or make it interesting for readers, then I probably won't do it. But stuff like Spider-Man, Spider Society, and Dick Tracy, these are characters like I grew up reading and loving. So it just, I've been thinking about it for decades. So there's definitely stuff to do, but usually what I try to do is boil down the character to its essence as I enjoy it and then riff off that. Which doesn't mean I ignore what came before or other stories, but it's more about consistency than continuity with other people's characters, for sure.
Mhm.
So you don't feel beholden necessarily to what came before. You want to kind of continue.
Um, you want the character to be recognizable. You don't want someone to read it and be like, Peter Parker, why does he have blonde hair? You know what I mean? Like it's
Mhm.
got to feel like the character, but I think there's just so much story that it's impossible to serve everything that came before. You want the stories that matter will resonate and people will recognize that you're not reflecting that, but there's just so much content that there's no way, if you're trying to please every issue that came before, it's just gonna feel like a wiki page.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So you've written an incredibly strong female character. Well, actually, a number of them, but I'm thinking about Annie in this case.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering, look, there's been legions of novels written by men writing female characters. and
Yes.
and some of them have been done really, really well, and
Hmm.
others have just been stereotypical caricatures.
Right.
Yours have been done very, very well, and I was
Thank
really
you.
impressed by the depth and the strength of Annie, her complexity, and you put her in some really kind of hilarious and painful and nuanced situations. Especially, I'm thinking of a scene in particular earlier in the book when she's kind of at the table with this guy who's giving her a hard sell, and the
Oh yeah.
smarminess is dripping off the page, and you just kind of captured every meeting like that I've
Yeah.
been in my
Oh,
life.
good. I mean, I'm sorry, but also good.
and
Yeah.
and it occurred to me, I mean, I you must have a lot of amazing, strong, brilliant women around you to inform, the kind of source material. But did you feel any imposter syndrome kind of embarking on that character and her daughter Margot and other strong female characters throughout the book?
Yeah, I think it would be questionable if I said no. I think if I said, oh, it's totally, it just came naturally. I felt it with Carmen,
Mm-hmm.
who is a woman, but also a queer woman. And Annie is a mom and a woman, and I'm a straight man. And so I think you don't know what you don't know. And so I think there's a lot of elements of people I know in my life, like strong women in my life, whether they be friends or people I grew up with, or my wife, or
Mm-hmm.
people in my family that I admire, and and then you become open to feedback. That's, I strongly believe in, authenticity reads and
Mm-hmm.
people to give you a gut check because, I haven't lived that experience. And so if someone says, well, this is probably a little off, and it definitely came up in Secret Identity where, I had readers that had Carmen's lived experience and they said, well, maybe you want to tweak this, or there's this trope that you're hovering really close to that you may want to avoid. And I thought that was really helpful. And I think there's this undercurrent in our industry where writers push back and say, well, I should be able to write whatever I want and there should be no governing of that. And first of all, there is no governing of that. You can write whatever you want, but you should try to write it well,
Yeah.
and you should try to write it thoughtfully and with care. And if you don't, someone's going to call you on it, and you need to be open to that as well. So, um, yeah, with Annie, I definitely like wanted her to feel like one of my like a friend, like someone I've known for a
Mhm.
long time, in the same way that Pete was a friend, but also Annie, I think, reflects a lot of people I know. It's never one for one, or never tell anyone in your life that a character is based on them, unless you want to hear it. But she's definitely an amalgamation of a lot of people I know, plus new characteristics that, as a writer, we inject into these characters. But um, I really tried to make her feel complicated and genuine, and not like a plot point. And I think
Mhm.
I always start with character for what it's worth. And I know a
Yeah.
lot of writers start with plot, and they're like, this is what the story is going to be, and I'm going to just kind of push this name through this story. But I can't get to the plot unless the character shows up in my head. And Annie showed up very developed, fully
Mhm.
formed almost.
Mhm.
And so that made the plotting much easier, because I kind of knew what she would do in those instances because I knew her. Um,
Mhm.
but it's hard, but I think you just need to be open to feedback and be open to maybe not hitting 1,000 every time, and course correcting. I mean, I'd rather work on it on the front end and get feedback and know I'm in the right ballpark, or I need to work on certain things and after the fact, because I just had too much of an ego to ask for help, you know?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I was going to actually say, to follow up, that you seem like someone, in the bit that I've known you and interacted with you. You seem
Hmm.
pretty refreshingly free of ego. Uh,
Oh,
no, I mean, which is a compliment. Not the
yeah.
case with all,
Thank you.
but I really think that
Yeah.
that does allow you to be open to that kind of feedback that actually makes it stronger and richer writing and characterization than to just go out and have that thing of like, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna push through on this thing that I think I know. And yeah, you
Mhm.
seem,
Yeah. I
you
mean,
embrace it.
thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think notes are good. I think, and I tell writers, if someone's taking the time to read your book and give you notes, like,
Yeah.
thank them profusely, but also listen to them. But there's also the heart of the story is yours. Like, so if you feel like the note is going to deviate it from what you want to do, then maybe cherry pick the notes. But I think if you're going to someone and saying, hey, I'm writing a character outside of my
Yeah.
experience, that you share that experience, can you please give me feedback on whether I'm in doing this right?
Right.
Mhm.
I would listen to them.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just that's
Mhm.
that's that's kind of why you're
Yeah.
there.
Quick note of advice to all writers listening: listen to your friends.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Listen to your beta
to your
readers.
beta readers. Get beta readers that you trust.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up because you just were talking about character first a few minutes ago, but I wanted to ask as well. Did you? I feel like I read somewhere where you were talking about, even before you bring the characters in, you start out kind of thinking of themes. Is that correct?
Mhm.
Did I get that right? Do you kind of go in with the?
It's not so much theme, and I don't mean to correct you because I'm not a theme writer. I'll see the theme like as I'm driving away from the book. Like I'll see it in the rearview mirror, like, oh, that's what I was thinking.
Okay.
Like even Liz, when you mentioned alter ego and the sobriety, I was like, that's it. That is it. She got it. Like that's what I meant. But I do think of story, like big story moments or ideas. Like for Secret
Mhm.
Identity, I was like, murder mystery in comics in the 70s with comics in it with a female protagonist. And then you kind of set the table, or I set the table in my mind and see what happens. And that's where Carmen showed up. And Annie was similar, I think, but Alter Ego was so much harder because I had this kind of success to match with Secret Identity, like, which is not a complaint, but so many people loved it. It won awards. It was very acclaimed. And so part of me was like, well, why do I need to have a sequel? Like it could just be this thing that was good. And I'm a firm believer that stories can end. Like you can just be done with the story, and that's okay. Um, and Zach, my editor, was like, well, there's another side to the coin. So that's the story. And he
Mhm.
was right, but it took me a lot longer to get to that story than it did. With Secret Identity was just happened naturally because I knew what I wanted to do. And the idea of like IP as the motive for murder was really fun to write.
Mhm.
Um, so the challenge here was like, how do I make a sequel that feels like it needs to exist? Like it's not just Jaws 2. Like no offense to Jaws fans anywhere, but like I looked at other sequels that worked. Like people remember The Empire Strikes Back because it's such a tonal shift from the hope and wonder of Star Wars. It's just
Mhm.
like really dark. And so or Godfather 2, like not to liken it to those films, which are classics, but Godfather 2 works because it's not the sequel you expect. It's not just the Vegas stuff. It flashes
Mhm.
back and you get the Vito Corleone stuff and all that. So my challenge to myself was like, I don't have to just do Carmen in the 80s, like, make it
Mhm.
into like this serialized detective story. I wanted to really treat it like its own novel that seemed to just live with this. They could click together if you wanted them to.
Yeah,
I think I just rambled on for like 10 minutes, but
No,
great stuff.
yeah.
it
Okay.
was a very clear, not ramble at all, and
Okay,
it
good.
gave me
Okay.
many more questions. Although now I'm thinking about Jaws too.
Yeah. Yeah, like some sequels don't need to exist, and that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yes, yeah. I'm also thinking about Poltergeist too, but
Mhm.
I'll get back on track.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's so many of those.
Well,
I like Ghostbusters too, so I wouldn't mention that.
I
But
love Ghostbusters too.
yeah, it's a fun
You
movie.
guys, just real quick, I'm deviating and I'll keep it very short. Do you guys know the story
Yeah.
behind Ghostbusters 2?
The
No,
what?
The story, the kind of the story of how it got made? So
No.
they,
no, tell
so
us.
they had done Ghostbusters. Bill Murray really, Ghostbusters did really, really well, obviously. So the studio
Hmm.
wanted to make a push for a sequel. Bill Murray, I think, is a little bit more in your camp, Alex, where he thought like, okay, that movie is what it was, and we can leave it.
Yeah.
But at the same time that was going on, Bill Murray really loved The Razor's Edge, the novel Razor's Edge, the
Mm.
Oh, okay.
100% Mom. And he had been trying to get a film of that made for years, and the studios just kept shutting it down. It's like, it's not going to work. So
Hmm.
he agreed to sign on to Ghostbusters 2 if the studio would let him finally make The Razor's Edge into a film. And that's basically why Ghostbusters 2 exists.
Oh, there you go. Well, good for
So he
him.
leveraged
Yeah.
he leveraged. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Smart.
yeah, it's interesting. So that's why both of
Yeah, I
them
support
exist,
that.
basically. Yeah.
I should know this, but did The Razor's Edge get made, and is it
It did.
good?
I liked it.
Okay,
It was not universally received very well at the time, but it was a passion project and he had enough, capital that he decided to get it done and he did it. So, yeah,
good for
good for him.
him.
Yeah, that's like Coppola and what's the name of the movie where Tom Waits made the soundtrack?
Right.
It, I'm blanking on it. I read a whole book about it like a few months ago. Well, it's mostly about Apocalypse Now, but it's also about the movie after that where he poured his entire fortune into it, which
Right.
I guess is a thing he does because he just did it recently
With
again. But
Cosmopolis, right?
yeah, with Megalopolis, yeah, which I haven't.
Megalopolis, sorry.
I want to see it, but definitely, yeah, he's mastered the art of doing the big budget thing, so you can do your own
Do the thing.
big budget thing. Yeah,
Which
Which
brings
is
us back.
also very meta with Alter Ego.
Exactly.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I'll kind of bring us back into the book stuff. Speaking of
Hmm.
the things that came before, I mean, in Alter Ego, and you did this also with Secret Identity, you kind of talk a lot about lineage, right? You pay homage to a lot of the artists and the writers that came before, a lot of whom were maybe under acknowledged in the industry because of
Hmm.
politics, because of race, because of sex, because of all of those things. And it got me wondering, in your case, like who were some of those writers? It could be comic books, authors, what have you, screenwriters, as you were coming up, who were like really kind of influential to you, and maybe anyone you want to shout out that was maybe under acknowledged or undersung.
Oh yeah, I mean, in terms of novels, the book that really like just blew my mind was Miami Purity by Vicki Hendricks, which I think is just a perfect little sexy noir.
Okay.
And it's a tweak on The Postman Always Rings Twice, and it's really what opened my eyes to being able to tell a dark, gritty story set in my hometown. Like she masterfully describes the weather and the idea, not just the weather, that sounds boring, but the idea of living in this tropical paradise where this dark undercurrent also exists. And I think that book did get some acclaim, but then she's not as well known for whatever reason as an author, but I think she's really just great. Um, and in terms of comics, like there's certain runs that I always go back to, and they're not underrated by any means, but it's not a superhero story. But Love and Rockets by Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez is a 40-year saga that they started on their own, self-publishing, and it eventually started getting published by this company called Fantagraphics. But each brother takes half the book, and Jaime, which is I love them both, but Jaime's stories really resonate with me, is a story told in real time about these kind of gutter punk Latina friends and sometimes romantic partners and how they get older and deal with life and fall apart and the ups and downs of their life. And it's drawn in Jaime's art is, I guess the easiest way to describe it is like punk rock Archie. Like
Mm.
it's very clean art and it's can be very funny, but it can also be very heart wrenching. And I go back and read it at least once every couple years, like in its totality, because it just feels so special, and I don't want it to end. And thankfully, they're still working on it. But those two come to mind. And there's bigger names that I look. I really love Jim Thompson. I don't think he's underrated, but I do think sometimes he falls a little bit off the radar in terms of like unreliable narrators and just writing really dark noir stories. The writers that spoke to me before I started doing it myself were, in terms of modern writers, were Laura Lippman, Dennis Lehane, and George Pelecanos, with some Michael Connolly, Walter Mosley, James Elroy. Like what I love about Elroy, even some of his books can be really hard to get into, is the meta of it all. He has the American Underworld trilogy, where is it a trilogy or is it a quartet? Anyway, it's a set of books that weave through American history, that period from late 50s all the way up to Watergate. And so that was a little bit of an inspiration for Secret Identity and Alter Ego, like taking your meta fictional events and weaving them through actual history. Like there's a moment in Secret Identity where Carmen goes to a Comic-Con that actually happened, and she runs into people that were actually there. Even some friends of mine, there's two characters called Joey and Greg, and those are actual people that I know were there selling their comics, and I just happened to know them. They didn't even know that until they read the book, and they were like, is that me? But anyway, those are the things that kind of get me excited about writing.
Mm. Well, along those lines, I knew we touched a little bit on Easter eggs and Easter eggs throughout your work, which Greg and I are huge fans of, and we
Good.
Easter egg a lot for each other, writing together
Good.
and having known each other for so long. And I noticed one or two characters with their names are distinctly spelled that I'm like, I think I know who this might be. But it's just making me think about also how much you've collaborated. I mean, you've talked about kind of in a lot of different forms, because you've collaborated literally with people, and then you've also had crossovers with characters, or like we just mentioned, names of people you know. Do you find that collaboration for you is more or less motivating than working on solo projects? Like, where do you fall on the spectrum of working well with others or preferring to work on your own?
I guess it depends. I mean, I love collaborating. I think it's fun. It's also neat to see how other people do it. You got kind of see under, with something like Dark Space, the sci-fi novel I wrote with Rob Hart. I got to really peek into his process because we were writing this long form novel together, and we spent a lot of time world building. And he does some things that I hadn't done before, like the backwards edit, where you read the book chapter by chapter, but backwards. So the energy that you normally put into the front of the book, you put into the back. And so you catch little plot things and see how they connect. Wow. And then he picked up things that I do, which is like building a cast document where I literally put pictures of actors and say, this is Annie, or this is Spinoza, this is whatever. And we did it for each Dark Space character. And he was like, oh, I never did that before, but it actually helps me visualize. I'm like, that's why I do it. And it, because I'm a very visual writer. So on a purely like selfish level, it's nice to see the tricks that other people use. But I also feel like when you're collaborating with someone that is open to feedback and takes criticism well and isn't precious and is willing to take notes, and it's all about the best idea, that you get a result that could not have been created by you alone. And those are the best moments where you're like, I could not have written this myself, but now my name is on it, so it's kind of like I did write it. You know what I mean? Like that sounds very basic, but it's the end result is something that you probably could not have done by yourself. And so that's the goal of collaborating. You get to pool your resources and do something that neither of you could have done solo. But there are also projects that I just could never share. The irony is that Secret Identity and Alter Ego are like that, but it has been collaborative because I worked with Sandy on the comic book sequences. Obviously, we had to work with a colorist, Gray Allison, and a letterer, Jack Morelli, on the comic itself. But it was still very much mine in terms of like the story and the idea. But Sandy was really, really essential in the comic, creating the comic. And so I kind of had the best of both worlds there. The comic became something that I hadn't expected. It became this really trippy, like very clear projection of Carmen's mind onto the comic page, as opposed to
Mhm.
this gritty, like street level superhero thing that I thought it would be. But Alter Ego and Secret Identity are very much like my little like art cinema thing. So
Right.
yeah, I guess it just depends on what I'm in the mood for or how precious I am with the idea. Like, do I want to share, or will it be fun to jam with somebody else? I think I'm always up for it.
Yeah.
In a similar vein to collaboration, I've heard you discuss the idea of um, books being sort of in conversation with other, works from other authors. Could you kind of talk about what it
Uh-huh.
means to you a bit?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that to Attica Locke, who I love. I love her work. I think she's really a fascinating and really talented writer. And I was listening to her at the Virginia Festival of the Book, and I think this must have been 2018. It was definitely pre-pandemic, and I was really stalling on that final Pete novel. I was like, why did I agree to do a fifth one? Like, Blackout was really good. I should have just ended it there. Um, and she mentioned something about the mother of the protagonist of her novel, and I was like, I've never talked about Pete's mother anywhere. Like, she's never mentioned in any of the books. Like, you have no sense, about his dad, how he was a homicide detective. And I literally bolted up from my chair, ran to my hotel room, and just started. And the title appeared, and I started writing. Then all the little threads that I was playing with, like that, eventually became the novel. So it was kind of like the setting of the table. Like, all the pieces were there. Pete was there, but I didn't have the through line of what's going to propel the story.
Mm.
Um, so that was really a good moment. And also something like Cavalier and Clay, which is a book that I loved
Mm.
as a reader, and I remember really absorbing heavily in college. And one of my big takeaways from the book was, I love this book, but I really want to see the comic book pages. And
Mm.
because it's a story set in the golden age of comics about the escapist, and they eventually did that comic as a separate thing. And but I really wanted to see the comics in the book. And so eventually I didn't think that I was going to be the one that got to do it with Secret Identity. So that was really
Mm.
interesting. And I have had one very brief conversation with Michael Chabon where I got to kind of profusely thank him. This was over the internet, so it wasn't like in person. But it was nice that he at least knew what the book was. He knew who I was, and he knew the book existed, so that was very
Mm.
flattering. But yeah, I think sometimes you see when creators have similar ideas around the same time. I do believe that there's like this greater like consciousness where we're all kind of pulling things from. So
Mm.
it is nice when you create something that feels like it's riffing off something else, or in conversation. I feel like it's the best way to describe it, because riffing off makes it seem like you're taking the idea. But yeah, I think we're all working in this space, and so sometimes things are gonna like brush up against each other, and that's okay. It can be fun.
Yeah.
I mean, I've since seen a lot of books that do the motif of Secret Identity, and that's good. That's cool.
Mhm.
I don't have a trademark on putting comics in your novel. It was just something that I thought was neat.
Right.
So I think we have to be open to that and okay with that.
Right. No,
Mm.
I love that idea of that kind of synergy, and that it's not, quite a collaboration, but there is that, like people talk about what the collective consciousness thing. And sometimes there's
Mhm.
something kind of wonderful about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of books that I was thinking about while writing Alter Ego. One of them was Night Film by
Mm.
Marissa Peschel, which I think is
Yeah.
a beautiful book and a very dark book. And I think what she does really well is she creates this fictional world where this director, so the character of Spinoza, who's this kind of like tarnished and disgraced movie producer, was very much felt like a Night Film character, like
Mhm.
this very secretive auteur who now has to slum it with superhero fiction because he's basically been canceled because he's behaved badly, and deservedly so has been canceled, or was on the brink of being canceled. So, you know, I think there's always books that you think about that are part of the DNA of your book.
Yeah, that's a great way
Mhm.
to put it. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and instead of being, derivative, it's, I think, homages and honoring these. I had forgotten about that book, I'm embarrassed to say, and
It's
I
so
love
good.
it
Yeah.
so much. So this is
Yeah.
a sign from you
Yeah.
to go back and read it.
Hmm.
I'm just wondering, take us back, Alex, to when you were, first reading. Was it comic books first, novels, a mix of both, graphic novels? What else, what were you consuming, and what's your kind of go-to?
Oh, as a kid or like starting
Mhm.
out?
Yeah. Or even just, yeah, starting out, both.
Yeah, I was a big Yeah, I was a pretty voracious reader. Like I read a lot of, I started out with like Archie comics because they were at the grocery store, so my mom would grab them for me as we were shopping, and that would keep me entertained for at least an hour. And I was really into those classic illustrated little books that had the spot illustrations and kind of like simplified prose. So I read a lot of those. Like I remember reading some Sherlock Holmes, Hound of the Baskervilles as a kid,
Mhm.
and I was so excited because I figured out who the killer was, and that was my first realization of plot. Like, oh, clearly the clues were there. The writer put the clues there for someone to discover or not discover. And that's really it still informs me in terms of like writing mystery. Like, you never want to write a mystery that the reader can't solve. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
you don't want it to feel like you're cheating the reader, but you also, you just want to serve the reader. You don't want to feel like you're cheating the reader. And so that really kind of points back to that. And then I was a really obsessive like sci-fi and true crime reader. I read The Godfather way too early. Like I think I was 8 or 9 when I pulled it off my grandfather's shelf, and I thought it was like a family book, and it was just not in the way that I thought. And the novel itself is so much pulpier than the movie.
Yeah.
Like it's just really, I don't know if you read the book. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there that maybe was not good, but it also taught me a lot about plot. Like when, I'm going to spoil a 60-plus-year-old book, but when Sonny gets killed at the toll booth, as a
Right.
reader, as a young reader, I was like, he's the main character. Like obviously he's going to become the next Godfather, and then they kill him, and I was like, wow, you can do that.
Yeah.
You can
Yes.
pull the rug out from under you, and it was really a defining reading moment. So I love stuff
Mm.
like that where you're reading a book and it really like kind of recalibrates your brain in terms of how you engage with stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I was a kind of a Wednesday warrior. Like every week, I'd go buy my comics at the comic shop, and I read a lot of sci-fi stuff, Star Trek, Star Wars, classic sci-fi, and then a lot of and more crime fiction as I got a little bit older, like straight up crime fiction as opposed to like true crime.
Right.
Mm.
Do you feel like, going into your own career as an author, are these, now that you're working in kind of all of these various mediums and so forth, do you feel like, is it sort of a collective skill set you're pulling from for any one of those? Are there different things that you kind of, utilize more for one than the other? Are you able to pull one, is one useful? Is something like you've learned from writing comics then proven useful for going back to writing crime stuff? Like, how does that kind of work for you, that whole?
Yeah, I think it's more about one medium helping the other. Like with comics, it's almost like an algorithm.
Mm,
You know, you only have so much space. You only have so many pages, and you only have so many panels you can put on the page, and so many balloons you can put per panel. You can only have one action per panel. So it's almost, I'm making it sound really business-like. It's almost like an algebraic formula, but
yeah.
it's like you have these little buckets to fill, and you have to really think visually. Like the artist is going to show Luke Skywalker waving his lightsaber, so I don't have to say Luke waved his lightsaber. Like so it allows you a little bit of freedom in terms of describing the art or like letting the art carry the weight. And so
Mm.
that feeds into my prose in that I like to think that my prose is pretty stark, not in a overly intentional way, but it doesn't over describe.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to tell you the clothes the character's wearing unless it's relevant to the plot. I think your readers are smart enough to assume that people are dressed normally until otherwise noted. Like there's so there's detail when detail is merited, but I'm not going to describe like someone's sweater or the car they drive. I mean, maybe I'll describe the car they drive, but writing comics has taught me to rely on the artist, and so that's kind of fed into my prose where I rely on the reader's imagination. Like I feel like we're having a conversation, and the reader's going to meet me halfway and create this visual picture in their mind. So I just need to give you enough
Mhm.
for you to do that. And I find as a reader that if someone over describes something, it pulls me out of the story because then I've literally lost the plot
Yeah.
because I'm just like so overwhelmed by detail.
Yeah.
But in terms of prose backwards to comics, it's really taught me like how to make each of those words count, like how to like try to inject style into those captions and word balloons, like make sure characters sound different, make sure uh, you're making your opportunity resonate as opposed to just be perfunctory. You want to serve the art, but you also want someone to be like, oh, that was a really nice turn of a phrase in this one caption box he had in this one panel. Like,
Mm.
those are the challenges. I don't think I get it right every time, but that's how they kind of play off each other.
Yeah. Cool.
Mm. Well, I'm curious because you self-described as prolific, and I mean, you have 2 projects out within a month's
Hmm.
time alone. How and you're a father, a husband,
Yeah.
you have a very full life, it sounds. So how the hell are you doing all of this? Like, what is your like, when you
Yeah.
sit down at the desk, what's happening?
I wish, sometimes I think it was Thriller Thursday, like today's Thriller Thursday newsletter. Like, Greg, you're part of that. It was about like when you write, and everyone's answers were so like defined. Like, I write in the morning, that's my best time, or I only write in the afternoon from 2 to 8, or I, but I wish I had that much structure. I really am like a firefighter, like what needs to be put out first, and
Mhm.
I do spend some time in the morning, kind of doing the admin stuff like email, following up. If anything is urgent, like I need to proof this comic or I need to fill out a form, like I usually try to do that stuff in the morning, and then get some writing done in the afternoon before, before the kids are home, and then I'm focused on dad stuff like making dinner or, homework, bedtime, things like that. And then if I'm really cranking, I'll do some writing in the evening. And I actually find that evening pocket to be best for novel writing.
Mm.
Which, like, I had a full-time job for years and years, and I was still writing novels, and I would write in the evening, and I found that was really a productive time because, the house is quiet, things are a little calmer. If you turn off the news, you can kind of like cram some words, and I find it more challenging to do that during the daytime. I find the comic stuff comes more easily in the daytime because it really is like uh almost not mechanical, but like structural. Like, okay, I'm
Yeah.
giving notes on the lettering pass, or I have to do the lettering script off this script, or write a pitch, which is not like final prose. Whereas with writing a novel, you really have to be in your own head. You have because you have to think,
Mhm.
you have to pour yourself into this one character you're writing. Um, this is a long-winded way of saying I don't really have any hobbies or do anything else. So,
Well, you do,
yeah,
you do the thing you do exceedingly.
yeah.
So, I think that probably
Right.
justifies the lack of.
Yeah, no, but it is a blessing. Like, that's the blessing, right? Like when your work is actually what you would do for fun. Like,
Yeah.
I was talking, I won't name the writer, but she's a friend of mine, and this is years ago, and it really resonated with me because she said, the secret is we would be doing this for free
Right,
anyway.
right.
So, and I think that's very true. It doesn't mean that the bills will get paid any faster, but it is very true. Like, I feel better when I get the stories out, when I put them on
Mhm.
paper and they're done, and I can then have that brief respite of like clarity. But we would probably be doing this anyway. So,
No, that's a very good point. You very seamlessly brought us back to one of the themes of alter ego, which will be
mhm.
as of airtime will be out tomorrow. So listeners, go grab it. We both read it; it's fantastic. Um,
Thank you.
but within the book, you talk a lot about art versus commerce. And it
Hmm.
sounds like from the way you're talking, the way you're kind of describing your day, it seems like you've been able to find a pretty good sweet spot between kind of artistic fulfillment and paying the bills. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, yeah. I think there was a moment where I was doing two full-time jobs. I was working in marketing and publicity for different companies in comics,
Yeah.
and also my writing was picking up to the point where it was like its own thing, which was great. But when you're a parent, you're paranoid. You're like, I need to like provide. I need to make sure that everyone is fed, and like rent is paid and things are okay. So I always hesitated to leave that security of the biweekly paycheck and health insurance and all these great things that come with having a job. But then I got laid off. Like, they laid off all the senior staff at my last job, and that's when I really thought, well, let's try it. Like, it felt like there was enough happening that we would be okay for at least a year or two, and it's been fine. But you know what? That could always change. Like, you never know, like how things will go. But so I try to not have any ego either way. Like,
Mhm.
it's great that I'm able to do it, and it's a
Mhm.
blessing to be able to do it, and I won't feel ashamed if I have to like get a job. But it's nice when my day job is something purely working for myself and creatively just doing stuff for myself and for others who pay me to do them. But I don't think I would have done it. I think it would have been harder for me to just like jump into it on my own, like to quit my job and do it. It was kind of like I was pushed into it, which worked out,
Mhm.
which is good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we talk about, I think, in every episode, and I'm really curious from your point of view, Alex, is the kind of duality of being a writer and then being an author. So, the
Hmm.
actual writing of the thing, the creating, being in your head, and then promoting. And especially in your
Oh yeah.
case, where you're in the comic world and the events are like on this whole other level. I just think about Comic Con
Yeah, yeah,
and my
yeah. It's wild. Yeah.
it's,
Mhm.
I needed a week vacation after I went to the last Comic Con.
Oh, were
So
you
I'm
there? Were
wondering,
you at New York Comic Con?
this was a couple of years ago, and I was actually
Oh, okay,
there
okay.
as a publicist with Anne Rice, and that's a whole story in and of
Oh,
itself.
wow.
But
Yeah. Wow.
being a publicist there is a journey too, because you're kind of like on the periphery, but you're in
Yeah,
it.
it's just like you're in the war zone. Yeah, it's crazy.
Totally, totally. But since you've kind of worked on all sides, what where do you fall on that spectrum? Like, do you prefer the writing part? Do you prefer the promotion? A little bit of both? What do you feel?
That's a great question. I was telling somebody this recently, and it was kind of a little bit of a complaint, but not a complaint. Just in general, like every time I work on something, I'm thankful that I have the professional experience that I do have in publicity and marketing because I'm able to kind of see what's really happening, like, and that's a good thing because it can help me be more collaborative. Like the PR and marketing team at Flatiron has been amazing and supportive, and I'm able to be additive to that. And then there's other
Mhm.
situations where you feel like you're bearing the burden, and this was not one of them, but it is always helpful to kind of be able to understand the language of marketing and publicity because sometimes I talk to author friends and they'll forward me the PR plan and I'll say, well, this is pretty standard. Like this is very boilerplate, which is not bad. Like I think as publicists, you have to kind of crank on your PR plans
Right.
and so on. But I feel like it's great that I'm able to understand that to some degree. Um, I do like the author stuff more. I mean, it's why I am doing that instead of still working in publicity and marketing. I loved promoting other people's stuff. I thought that was fun. Like there's a math problem to it, almost like a figuring out of like what is the root of this book that I can kind of tease out and interest the press and get people to write about this comic or like how can I get the New York Times to cover this book? It is cool that I'm able to do that for myself, but it's also feels a little self-serving. But I mean, I guess
Mhm.
that's what it is. But I do hesitate to put too much of myself out there. I just feel like sometimes people get tired of the noise, like there's just too much noise. So how do I balance it out? I try to talk about other people's books as much as I can. I try to like organically say, this is good. I really like this, or I read this, or try to be generous with blurbs if time permits, like especially for writers that are starting out or writers that maybe don't get the attention they deserve. Like, if a bestseller asks me for a blurb, they probably don't need my blurb, like
Right.
like so try to make it count where you can, but
Mm.
I think I think we're in a point, and you guys can probably relate to this too, where it's almost like you have to be banging the drum constantly just to get attention. Like,
Yeah.
uh, you guys have a podcast and there's a newsletter, and I feel like sometimes it's just like we have to draw the line at some point to care for ourselves, to like to be able to breathe. And I'm not the one to put all my personal stuff online. I think some mystery is good. Like it's okay to not know everything about my life or not, I don't post pictures of my kids on my Instagram. I don't do like, there's a lot of public facing things I don't do. Because I think it's okay to have a personal life and have a public life. And I think sometimes um, not a criticism. Like I think some authors lean into that more and like pour everything out into their public facing roles. And
Mhm.
I think whatever works for you and whatever works for your comfort level. But for me, it's really about like make sure the work is good and then find ways to get people to engage with the work. Because if they're engaging with me and like then we've missed the point somewhere.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
but it's hard. It's really hard. It's like the challenge is like when is promoting yourself too much? Like when are you doing it too much? And sometimes like particularly for me towards the end of this year, it felt like, wow, I have a lot of stuff coming out and I've basically got something to talk about every day. And so it's being judicious about that. Like there have been moments where two things were announced and I was like, well, I'm going to promote this one and I'll save this one for tomorrow.
Mhm.
So everyone is not sick of me. But I'm also like a triple Pisces. So I'm always like super sensitive that people are mad at me and maybe they're not. So I don't know.
Not to
I
So
relate.
not to put you on the spot, but since wrapping up, and you've been so generous with your time as you are
Oh, thanks. Yeah,
this
this was
member of the
fun.
writing community. We would love to give you a couple minutes to maybe, talk about whatever you want people to know, where to find you out in the world, on the socials, what you have that you're working on that you're excited about, anything you want to jump into.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Thanks for having me. This was so fun, and it
Yes.
just felt like we were chatting, so it didn't feel like work. Here I am slagging, like doing publicity and on a podcast promoting my book. But you can find me at alexsegura.com. That's like gonna get you wherever you need. All my books are there. I have a newsletter, alexsegura.substack.com, and that's really like it is a promotional newsletter. Like I haven't figured out like what new thing I want to do. Like I feel like your Substack is really good, Greg, because it's got a theme each week. It feels like very curated. Whereas,
Well, I'm
yes,
I'm just going to give all of the credit on that to Lauren Nassett, who was the one.
yeah, she's
It's
great.
her brainchild. I know you guys are friends, but
Yeah.
so yeah, I'll take zero credit for that. Basically, Lauren put it
Okay.
together. I get to coast off of her hard work. So if Lauren, if you're
Yeah, no, I just think there's authors that do really creative stuff with their Substacks, like Andrea Bartz, who is great, interviews a new writer every week, and I'm like, how does she do that? Like, how does she have the time to do that? And so my newsletter is very much just like this is coming out, and these are links that might interest you. I am on Blue Sky and Threads, but I'm most active on Instagram just because I like it better. It's just pictures, like there's no drama. Like Twitter really burned me. Like I left Twitter about a year ago, and I felt like this great weight lifted. And like now you've seen the spike of people leaving Twitter, and I was like, yep, it's not a good place anymore. It's not a happy place. And what I would say to new writers who feel like, oh, if I leave Twitter, I'll lose my readership. You won't, because just because you have 40,000 followers on Twitter, I mean, if they all bought your book, you would be doing great, and they're not all buying your book. It's just like, it's all, we should really focus on like promoting ourselves and creating a network for ourselves that you kind of feed through these outlets. But if you're hinging all your success on like threads, they could change the algorithm tomorrow, and nobody will be hearing what you're posting. So it's like that's why I think newsletters are really valuable, because it's your own little piece of real estate that you can control. Um, in terms of new stuff, yes, Alter Ego comes out tomorrow, right? Yeah, tomorrow. Yeah, Legendary Links is already out, so you can get that wherever comics are sold. And I also have another novel coming out tomorrow. It's an Encanto middle grade book, so it's like a prequel to Encanto the film. It's called Nightmares and Sueños, and it's basically what happened to Bruno. Like, so I get to talk about, yeah.
Oh my
So
God.
yeah, if you are buying Alter Ego and you want to buy something for your child at the same time, you should get that as well.
the holidays,
We don't talk about Bruno, but we do.
Yeah, we do. We do talk about Bruno. So
That is so exciting.
holidays
Oh
are
my
approaching.
God, Alex. That's a great, so many great pieces of advice. Thank you so
thank you.
much for your time. You've
Oh,
been
this
so
is great.
generous. Yeah, we're such
Yeah,
fans. We hope you'll come on again really soon.
I'm
And
happy to.
good. Well, hopefully
Yeah.
we'll see you in real life. But everyone, check out all of Alex's new and upcoming projects. And I'll just take us out with Impostor Hour with Liz and Greg, is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Bookwild Collective founder Kate Herget, and Scott Leeds composed our original theme music, and Steve Luoma designed our logo.
And you can find us on IG at Impostor Hour Podcast and online at impostorhour.com. Thanks for tuning in.